Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining, everyone. So today we're very excited to have Claire Monteleone here. Claire is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science here at CU Boulder. She's also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Environmental Data Science, which launched in 2020. She joined CU Boulder in 2018, following positions at the University of Paris, CNRS, George Washington University, and Columbia University. She has a PhD from master's in computer science from MIT, and was a postdoc at UC San Diego. She also holds a bachelor's in earth and planetary sciences from Harvard. Her research on machine learning for the study of climate change helped launch the new thriving field of climate informatics. And she co-founded the International Conference on Climate Informatics, which turned 11 years old this year. She's attracted climate scientists and data scientists from over 20 countries and 30 US states. And I'll stop there. Go ahead and take it away, Claire.
Thank you for reading my bio and for the warm welcome to Earth Lab. Cool. So this picture is from Aspen, where I was for an Aspen Global Change Institute workshop. So we somehow have nature, we have animals using this bridge that humans can also use, and we have power lines. And somehow we're all going to have to live sustainably. One thing that we can maybe take as a challenge at the frontier is societal impacts of environmental hazards and cascading hazards. So here in Boulder, we had the Marshall Fire, which was a bunch of extremes all at once. So snow drought conditions, we had extremely dry land cover. That's relatively anomalous not to have snow in fall and winter. And then we had anomalously high winds. So then all it took was a single human ignition. And then this fire was able to jump across Route 36 and just attack these suburban communities. Or in 2018 in Santa Barbara County, California, there was a confluence of drought followed by wildfire, followed by an intense rain event in the burn scar. And then we had these debris flows. So boulders, leveling homes. Unfortunately, there was a lot of loss of life in that one. So taking these maybe as a frontier, how do we eventually predict and mitigate such compound hazards? But more broadly, I work on climate informatics due to both these extremes and the warming and changing of the climate that we've been seeing under climate change, following a vision that machine learning can shed light on climate change. And this is also recognized universally. So the World Economic Forum put out a white paper calling for AI to be harnessed for the Earth, right? We see AI harnessed a lot in industry, but can we apply it to address our environmental challenges? And climate informatics, which Chelsea referred to, has been an idea that I've been pushing for over a decade. And I guess the key things here as regards Earth Lab is that we found from 2015 that hackathons were a really good way to engage students and people of different backgrounds. Each team in a hackathon given to us by a domain scientist would need to have, some programming ability and maybe some ML and data science knowledge, and also some scientific understanding of the problem. So that sort of helped things accelerate. And if you work in this area, if you're at Earth Lab, you probably work on something relevant to climate informatics. So we're having our next conference in April in the Cambridge in the UK. But what I've been doing with these sort of survey talks is to explain the three thrusts that I've been working on, and some of them are more like ongoing or future work, and kind of choose your own adventure. Then we can decide if we want to dig deep into any of these three thrusts. So I'll give vignettes from each of the three thrusts. So the first one, I think, is most able to interface directly with climate modelers and climate scientists, where we're trying to improve predictions of climate change and looking at all these interacting processes. I mostly mentioned ocean, atmosphere, and kind of water cycle properties, because that's what I've worked on so far, but the land model and of course the cryosphere are really important as well. The second goes back to the pictures at the intro, streams, and with cascading hazards as like a frontier to aim toward how can we improve AI-driven predictions even of individual extremes. And then the final one turns away from climate science or weather forecasting itself towards mitigation and adaptation. So AI can play a role in a lot of different parts of our societal adaptation. Ideally, the green transition of industry, although so far I've only worked on the energy transition. So my goal is to give a taste of each of these three with sort of, I've done the most work on the first, the medium amount of work on the second, and the least work on the third, and then see maybe in the Q&A if people want like more details on any of them. Okay. Wow, is it not seeing the power? That's kind of weird. I just got like a urgent warning.
Yeah, secondary power person.
Well, so I know that these adapters don't transmit power that well. Well, I am plugged in. I wonder if this thing doesn't have power in it. Okay, just 1 second. I think it stopped the warning, so we'll just keep going. Okay, so about AI for climate science. So I think it's just that I was using this. I'm gonna try going straight, but it's good to have another one in the room. Thank you. Okay, so a huge thrust of our AI work in this space has been using the output of climate models along with observations and AI algorithms to get an adaptive ensemble prediction from multiple climate models. And so I'm going to give a little vignette about that on the next slide, but that's been a huge thrust of what we've been doing. We've also been using techniques in AI for analyzing causality in a probabilistic sense to drill down on how we're going to even define the ENSO index. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation is predictive of so many extreme phenomena across the globe, depending on phase, whether you're in El Nino or La Nina, you expect different kind of precipitation or dryness extremes in different regions. But there's a historical way that it's measured that was not come upon in a data-driven way. You just look at a particular part of the Pacific. And so can we see the relation of heat anomalies, which you would look for in the normal index, the relation between them at 1, 2, and 3 month lags to see sort of where the source of these anomalies are in the timescales that we care about for forecasting El Nino and La Nina events, to ultimately improve predictions of very important tasks that are related to ENSOs, such as precipitation extremes in India due to the Indian summer monsoon. And then the third thing in this domain is that we're working directly with modelers at NCAR, as well as a NASA team that takes altimetry data down to, millimeter accuracy at a geographically explicit grid, and trying to do a very ambitious thing of improving sea level rise, forecasts of sea level rise trends at a 30-year lead, where we just have altimetry for less than 30 years into the past. And seeing if we can use ML plus all the climate model projections to have skill. Okay, so those are the topics in that main thrust that I'm currently working on. And I'm going to do a slightly deeper vignette into the top one. Standard AI or machine learning, if you take an intro machine learning class, the theory behind why all the algorithms work is based on a statistical assumption of independently identically distributed data. So your training set is drawn from the same distribution as your test set, meaning there's one distribution, one probability distribution. It's not changing over time. And I was already interested in violating this assumption in my past work, which we would call the non-stationary setting. How do you design algorithms when the data distribution is changing over time? And I was interested in this. There were applications, for example, in the stock market. So I had previously worked on algorithms that take a bunch of predictions and try to put variable weights on them that adapt over time based on the performance of the predictors. Then my student came along and we were applying this to climate, where we have variable or non-stationarity over both time and latitude and longitude, so other dimensions than just time. And so we wanted to learn the level of non-stationarity in both time and space. This is a very simple idea of how you would do this if you gridded up the Earth and just said that you'll share dependence with your north, south, and east, west neighbors. But we could use any kind of neighborhood scheme, or we could use other work in our field to learn the neighborhood scheme. So basically, if you have a climate model that's performing well in Denver, you might have your model assume that it'll also perform well in Boulder, for example. And we found that by imposing and then learning the structure, we got better performance on these spatiotemporally non-stationary problems. But this was also open in machine learning, because we did contribute algorithms to learning from data that changes over time, but it was completely open to simultaneously have data changing over time and other dimensions. For us, it's latitude and longitude, but we showed it for financial markets from different countries in a finance application. And so more generally, distributed online learning was open. There was no theory behind it. And luckily on sabbatical, I was able to visit the person who wrote the book on online learning and pitch this problem to a student, and we were able to contribute to algorithmic learning theory. The other aspect that's kind of interesting here, we have a neighborhood maybe in space, in lat-long grid boxes, but you can also think about similarity in time of forecasts if you have to forecast at a bunch of lags simultaneously. So say in January, I have to output a prediction for February, March, all the way through December. So I have to, at every month, output 11 different predictions at different lead times. This was not really studied in AI. It was being used in seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasting. And it turns out there's analogs that were relevant in financial volatility, in financial stability and monitoring. So forecasting volatility from, I guess, implied volatility, for example, of the Dow ensemble. So basically the idea is if you do multitask and share influence between the predictions at different lags, you can get better performance on every single lag than if you trained independently, except the shortest lag. So the shortest lag is not really helped by seeing data that is more stale. but all the other lags are getting to kind of see how your prediction performed. So it's sort of like saying if the NCAR model is good at predicting from January to May, let's assume it's also pretty good at April and June. Okay, so it's assuming, exploiting, and then discovering kind of this neighborhood structure in time. Okay, so that was the vignette. Of course, we could do deeper dives. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so with the neighborhood model in space or in time, how is that sort of updating the non-stationarity assumption? Can you just explain that link and that connection for me?
Sure. So, okay, give me an ensemble of climate models. Maybe it's the IPCC ensemble, or maybe it's just NCAR run at 12 different starting conditions, or maybe it's NCAR where they're tweaking one internal parameter on a component model, right? There's all sorts of ways you can get ensembles. I want to always predict with a weighted average over the predictors, but I want to adaptively update the weights based on present and past performance. So I want, it's in AI, we call it explore versus exploit. So I want to actually exploit the best predicting model by putting a lot of weight on it. But if I did that too much, then I wouldn't be nimble should conditions change. So what I do is I mix in a little bit of the uniform. So I always, even though I put a lot of weight on the best performing model, I always share weight with the rest of the ensemble. So no weights go exponentially fast to zero. So should conditions change, I actually adapt quicker than if I just did kind of like a winner takes all and put all the weight on one model. And so this is not necessarily, well, okay. I had a student that used financial data to try to forecast the flash crash of May 2010, which was like a computer glitch or something. And it didn't forecast it, but it recovered, our algorithm recovered quicker than anything else that was like being used by banks at the time. So basically yeah, I mean, actually, if I have slides on that, it's sort of like a Bayesian updating of an appropriately defined hidden Markov model. And the spatial version is like Bayesian updating of an appropriately defined Markov random field over a lattice grid. But that becomes totally intractable, whereas we have this lightweight approximation to it.
Okay.
Yeah. But maybe that's
I
something.
couldn't do it, but I'm following.
Yeah, maybe that's something that we could drill down on in the remaining time. I have slides that zoom in to what the hell this is. Excuse my French. Cool. So moving right along, this other thrust is specifically around extremes. I mean, I definitely think it's highly related to the first thrust, but this has us talking to people that predict weather, which is, a different community than climate science. And also we have that like long-term inspirational goal of getting a handle on these cascading hazards. So a couple points I'll make. So for the hurricane track forecasting, I'll drill down a little bit in a vignette, and also for the avalanche detection. I did mention that we're working, or we have had collaborations with IMD, which is the meteorological department in India, because of course the Indian summer monsoon and resulting drought and flood affects the GDP of the entire subcontinent. So, and it's a notoriously intractable prediction task, but adding in AI, they've had skill and they were actually able to incorporate AI into some of their monsoon forecasting. The only other point I'll make on this slide was this work we did actually a while ago. A theory student of mine, she heard that I was interested in extremes. And so she went to the literature to see how that was defined. And more often than not, it was just looking at a threshold, like when your precipitation gets above a threshold or etc. Now that's brittle. It's univariate typically, and it's not probabilistic. So the idea is, can we do something akin to sort of a Bayesian hierarchical clustering, actually something called topic modeling from natural language processing, to just take in lots of different climate variables and learn climate topics, which are just distributions over climate variables in their different mean or extreme high, extreme low states, and then inspect those resulting topics. So it's a projection onto a lower dimensional space of climate topics. Many of them might just be average, everything's about average, but we did detect some extremes. We detected things that have the signatures of heat waves, things that have signatures of wet events. And it's just really neat because it's multivariate, unsupervised, soft, like no thresholding because it's probabilistic. And that was just a cool idea. And so this means that even unsupervised learning, this was an old thing we tried, although my team is really interested in unsupervised and generative learning now, probabilistic models, has something to offer in even how we just define extremes, because we want a flexible way to define extremes that can discover different kinds of extremes, which will allow us to track them. Cool. So now the two vignettes, one on hurricane track prediction. So this postdoc, Sophie Giffard-Roisa, who was here for a bit, took existing storm track data and at the center of each storm, which is recorded on a 6-hour basis, lat-long coordinates, she basically registered these wind fields around the center at 3 geopotential heights. Okay, so she created a data set. And then this was just supervised learning because we did have the storm track data and we were trying to predict tracks from 6 to 24-hour leads at 6-hour intervals. And we found that the best way to do the fusion was via pre-training. So we would predict the XY coordinate at the desired lag just using the wind fields and train that model, the wind CNN. So it's a convolutional neural network. Do the exact same task, but using the fields of geopotential height indicating our pressure fields. And then we also had, it was 0-dimensional, but we had the last few XY coordinates of the storm. So we could do just like a feed forward neural network to train that. So these were all pre-trained. And then the fine tuning, we would clamp the weights and just train a few fully connected layers on the same task, the final lat-long from all the same inputs. And that's what got the best lift. So that's sort of deep learning for fusing different data types. And it performed as well as present models from the National Hurricane Center. And sometimes it was able to predict things that the human wasn't predicting, like a storm turning at a different time. So we don't propose like replacing the humans or replacing the physical models, but having it there as another decision support tool for the people that have to make these calls. Okay.
And did it go faster, like computationally faster in the prediction, or like what would
We did not benchmark any of those computational issues. That's room for future work. But often people do claim if they're learning an emulator, the idea is that, okay, you have to train it, but then inference should be much faster than trying to run, the discretization of a PDE or something that would be used to iterate into the closed form solution that you have from your differential equation. I mean, not closed form, just iteratively approximate that differential equation. Okay, jumping gears a little bit, still deep learning, but leaning heavily on unsupervised learning. We were doing avalanche detection, which avalanches are rare. So in ML, we would call that extreme class imbalance. So if you have, we had synthetic aperture radiation, SAR imagery, of snow in the Alps. And finding avalanche deposits is rare in those images. So it's extreme class imbalance if the two classes are there are avalanche deposits in this image patch or there's not. The second, but just you could also view that as we're trying to do anomaly detection. The second challenge for ML was that we only had a limited amount of ground truth data. And we didn't have SAR imagery segmented by humans, because apparently that is a very hard task to look at the SAR imagery and find the avalanche deposits in snow. So we had no in-between product. We just had ground truth data where trekkers, I think this survey was run by Météo France, went into these avalanche corridors in the French Alps, trekking and looking for avalanche deposits. So we want to reduce the risk of humans having to go do that. And we want to learn almost like a synthetic sensor that is like a human, but a mapping from just the SAR imagery to whether there's an avalanche in the image patch. So I think what was the most interesting was this twist we took on standard anomaly detection using unsupervised learning. So standardly, this whole architecture, just think of this as a deep neural network whose weights are being fit. It's called a variational autoencoder. But standardly, these can be used for anomaly detection by training them on the nominal class. So that means you just train them on image patches known to not have an avalanche in them. Okay, so once it's trained, if you send an unknown image patch and it's similar to what it was trained on, then you don't think you have an avalanche. But if it's quite different, as judged by the error comparing the output of the net to the input, the reconstruction error, then you might say there's an avalanche. So there'd be a threshold on the reconstruction error above which we call anomaly. That exists in the literature. The twist we took was that we had such limited labeled data that we didn't want to waste any of it at the very beginning, labeling image patches to find out the ones that were nominal, right? Because that requires labeled data. So instead, we just leaned in heavily to the unsupervised learning and actually trained on any image patches that we had in our SAR data, not knowing if they were nominal or anomalous. And we used all the labeled data. So we used the labels that we had only for the hyperparameter tuning, which is the choice of this threshold on reconstruction error above which you classify an anomaly. And this actually outperformed both a CNN supervised approach we had to the task, which suffered from the severe class imbalance and the severe small amount of labels. But it also even outperformed the standard way of using a VAE in an anomaly detection pipeline, which is that you have to label your data first to get the negative examples to train the VAE on. Now, this might seem counterintuitive at first, but keep in mind that after training, whether trained on all sorts of data or just the negative class, both of those two methods, let's call the first one like the semi-supervised way of training the VAE and the second one the unsupervised. For both of them, you have a labeled validation set on which you tune your hyperparameter. And so they're going to end up having different thresholds on reconstruction error such that you say that you have an avalanche. So the thresholds will be different, but the performance so first off, the version that was trained unsupervised was able to train on more data. But second off, it had more diversity in its data. And since you do get to finally tune your threshold on to match the labels of a labeled data set, we view this as essentially a form of regularization, which means you've seen more diversity in your data, so your model is better able to generalize. Okay. And then the last main thrust is about using AI wherever it can be helpful in the green transition. For now, we're mostly working in renewable energy with NREL. We are having a paper come out on showing the skill of certain deep sequence learning models at forecasting solar irradiance at week ahead. And actually, we have evidence that we can do it even out to 2 weeks, which is better skill than NWP, than numerical weather prediction models. And we need these like forecasts that relate the meteorological variables to solar irradiance in order to predict how well a farm of solar panels is going to do at producing power. And when we have uncertainty on that, that just translates to cost that the grid operators have to eat. So if we want to have financial incentives for more renewables to be included into grids, we need to ratchet down the uncertainty in forecasts of their outputs. So we want to do this for wind as well. And to that aim, we're doing a project to just downscale meteorological data that is modeled by climate models to the level that is relevant for renewable energy forecasting and planning. And in the US, we've got lots of data, so we can do downscaling techniques to go from coarse grids to fine grids using supervised learning methods. But we also have developed unsupervised learning methods to do so. So we can validate those against the supervised methods in the US, where we have just so much data. And then in India, we don't necessarily have validation data at the fine grid, but having validated our algorithms in the US, we can take those unsupervised algorithms and apply them in India where we don't have the supervision. So I'll do just a very quick vignette about the technique behind this. So we took a technique in the literature called a line flow, which makes use of two normalizing flows. Normalizing flows, I'll describe on the next slide, but it's a generalization of variational autoencoder where you don't have to only learn Gaussians, but it allows you to basically estimate probability densities. So how is this different from the entire literature on statistical downscaling? So most statistical downscaling algorithms that we had seen, you could downscale data from a coarse grid to a fine grid. Say you have a field of precipitation at a coarse grid, and you also had data at a much finer grid of precipitation in the same region. Then as long as you had these paired maps, that's how you trained your method. And so we would call that as supervised. So we just need access to the high and low resolution data for the same field, but they don't have to be actual paired. They don't have to be pairs. And then also generally they were providing point predictions. It's a confusing word because it's not a point, right? It's an entire grid of points, but just one grid of points would be the output, as opposed to a probability distribution over such grids. And then the contribution of using this sort of generative type technique, normalizing flow-based technique, is also around interpretability, because there's an explicit latent space that your data is projected onto, and you learn a probability distribution over that. And then you can kind of visualize what the model sees as the connectivity of this space. So looking at the space directly is generally no use, but pushing out samples at fine scale and coarse scale from any position in latent space is interesting. So here what we did was, after having trained the model, we had fine resolution images at these two ends as input. The model, using the learned weights that it learned for its, its deep learning, its normalizing flows, projected down to this latent space, and then took a walk in the latent space connecting these 2 points. There's a whole literature now on how to even take these walks. It's out of scope. But from each point, we could then go back and generate coarse resolution and fine resolution images. And so this is sort of the model's view of a temporal interpolation of precipitation maps at fine and coarse resolution. So the bottom images were all generated, and then the top images, only the endpoints were given to the trained model for this interpolation visualization. And then the guts behind this, the ML advance that was most used for this was a normalizing flow. So a variational autoencoder will learn a Gaussian over this latent dimension. Basically, you're sort of learning a compression of your data into a lower dimension and then allowing it to be probabilistic as a Gaussian. But if you want to complicate your distribution to be closer to the data and away from your prior, which could be Gaussian or uniform, then as long as you're composing a bunch of bijections of which you're learning the parameters in your deep learning model, then all the sort of math can be done on your simple prior, but you can get these much more complicated distributions than just Gaussian or uniform. And then you would regularize, you would make sure this doesn't overfit by balancing off in your loss function an objective that's trying to draw this function composition closer to your prior. So that's the trade-off between over and underfitting. So then you've got this posterior distribution over your latent space. And since all the functions you composed were bijections, you can then flow in either direction. So that means that you could take a sample from your posterior over the latent space as much as you want and generate fake data so you can use it generatively. Or you could start with an input image and then sample conditionally on that input image. The architecture that we did was from a line flow. So we just learned not only the parameters for this flow, but parameters for another flow linking another data space. So this is the data space at coarse resolution, for example, and this is the data space at fine resolution. And we have flows learned to the same latent space. So it's called a domain alignment technique. Okay. So these are all things I could go deeper into. I will, just for those of you that might be computer scientists, mention that such applications did end up posing open problems in machine learning. And we like kind of working at the sweet spot because I have people getting PhDs in computer science. We want to advance AI as well. The whole thrust on online learning with spatiotemporal non-stationarity was new, and we ended up affecting even the theory of online learning. Prediction at multiple timescales simultaneously was also new, I believe, although multitask learning was an existing method that we showed could work well there. And then the whole idea of what we did in Avalanche is just a general approach, is lean heavily or almost entirely on unsupervised learning when you have class imbalance and very limited labeled data, and just use your labeled data for hyperparameter tuning. This last box, I wouldn't say we really totally addressed. We created a data set for hurricane tracking, but if you think about this in terms of what is already in the computer vision literature versus what we have to do in our domain, there's still a lot of scope for innovation, because the computer vision literature will say that they have techniques and architectures for spatiotemporal learning. Okay, so they're training on video, and they're making use of things in video that is not true on a geospatial data set. So in video, you've got foreground and background. You don't have that when you have ephemeral patterns in fluids in the fields that we look at. In video, a deformable object could be me or a cat, not, again, a pattern that emerges and then goes away. So there is a lot of scope on spatiotemporal data plus time that is not addressed in the AI literature. And then sort of to finish out this survey part before we go into questions on specific stuff, I'll talk just briefly about challenges. So often the data is the limitation, and we showed one way of addressing that in the avalanche technique. But more generally, the data limitation that we have is with time, right? We don't have instrumentation back before a certain amount of time. And we don't have any diversity of trajectories that the Earth could have taken because we don't have a counterfactual Earth, we don't have a twin Earth. So what we're increasingly seeing, and those of you that have access to proprietary products like from Google or our intelligence agencies, we're increasingly seeing very, very, very fine resolution in space, in location. So we can get down to very fine resolution in space. Can we sort of, for the purpose of machine learning, which lacks the diversity over time, can we somehow use the spatial diversity that we have as a proxy? So if one region had a certain climate intervention performed on it, how did it recover? And can we take any of those lessons to another region, for example? The modelers are dealing with the resolution of things that occur at drastically different scales in space and time. The reason why clouds are not in the climate model is that the atmosphere circulates on the order of 2 weeks, the ocean circulates on the order of several hundred years. And these clouds often are occurring at their coupling. So spatially, it's very hard to resolve exactly. And also cloud models look at water droplets adhering to an aerosol. So they have to look at a very small spatial scale. And we know the climate models are, they're getting to smaller and smaller scales, but they're not at that scale. So a whole crew of people are looking at taking ML inside a climate model and trying to address what they call climate model parameterization problems. And there's been a lot of progress on that in other teams. What we've been focusing on is taking data and downscaling it in unsupervised ways. By the way, the AI doesn't care where the data came from. You might think you want to downscale climate model data to be at the scale of some reanalysis product. We actually did the opposite. So we used a reanalysis product as our coarse grid, and we used our downscale data from numerical weather modeling. So it doesn't really matter. Non-stationarity, we did talk a fair bit about that. And then interpretability. So I am more of a proponent of VAE and normalizing flow than GANs for the moment, because you got to see a window into what the model, how the model would interpolate over time in that picture, because there's a latent space. There's a posterior over a latent space explicitly represented as part of the model. A GAN doesn't have that. And there's increasing evidence that the GAN is just creating little distributions around each training data point, like celebrity faces. A lot of the generated faces are very similar to training faces, or they could interpolate between two faces. But it turns out evaluation of generative models is an active area of core ML research. What is the state of the art? There is a paper to check, a check that you can run to show that your model did not memorize the training data. So that's a positive result, but it's like much farther away than we need to be, because I see cloud modelers and precipitation studies at AGU, where they'll throw up some pictures of clouds generated by GANs and then say, future work, check whether this distribution faithfully represents the distribution of clouds in reality. Well, if we had a model for the distribution of clouds in reality, we'd be done. We wouldn't be learning again. And it gets rather philosophical, and the bad news is this is open even in AI. This is one of my students is trying to work on that. So thanks. And once we have papers, I should start putting your names here as well. Yeah, and we're right across campus, or we're on main campus nearby, so feel free to stop by. So that was the prepared stuff, but happy to have a discussion. A lot of questions. I start with the back.
So question, and I guess I'll maybe focus on the first chunk of the assignment.
Sure.
So how much better is it than, say, a simple median of the ensemble models? How do you know if you're overfitting? And are your models useful for climate scientists to improve their own models?
Great. I'll repeat the question on Zoom. It was for the online learning for combining model ensembles. How much better did it do than using the median instead of the mean of the multi-model mean? The third one was, can climate models use this to improve their own models? And sorry, what was the second one?
How do you know if you're overfitting?
Okay. So let me just see if I have any slides on that project. I don't have them in the current deck, but I could use them. We compared to the multi-model mean. We did not compare to the median. And the evaluation was done on hindcasts, where you can actually say, how much better do we do against the true history than the multi-model mean? And that was notable. So I would posit it would do better than median, but hopefully the median performs better than the mean.
As an example. So
Yeah.
How much better is it than? How do you quantify? I mean, how do you know if the added complexity is sort of worth it?
Yeah.
In terms of the
So
performance?
so this is a paper called Tracking Climate Models. We have a lot of detail in it. And yeah, we did very well for historical. For future projections, we used the true model assumption, or the perfect model assumption, where you basically take one model out of the ensemble and you'll test against it at the end, but you won't train with it. And this technique outperformed the multi-model mean at predicting that model, because we see into the future, the multi-model mean, there's spread into the future where all the models pretty much diverge from the multi-model mean. So, and then we also did batch sort of evaluations. So the online evaluation, do you guys have a good pen? Oh, maybe this one. The online evaluation is saying you've trained up until this point, and then you predict the next point. And so we did both monthly and annual. And the batch technique is that you just train on some region and test on the future region. Here, this keeps sliding over. And that has theoretical guarantees with respect to just plain cross-validation. Oh, wow, thank you.
All the markers. Color
Um,
color outside.
So yeah, there's a lot of details in this paper. And then, yes, climate modelers said they did think they could use this to improve their own models, because what they would do, one idea was to create an ensemble that has like CMIP3 and CMIP6 and see if our model actually puts more weight on CMIP6, like are the models improving? So that could be one way. And then you can also look at the learned distributions. So out of political correctness, we never let a model weight go to 0. So we're always predicting with a weighted average, but you can see which models get much lower weight. How do they use it? How could they use it to improve their models? Sure, you take a perturbed physics ensemble of different initialization conditions, or the kind, I forget what they call it, where you just take one parameter inside a component model and perturb it, run the algorithm, and it'll see sort of which parameter value works the best, at least for the hindcasts. And then, yeah, I mean, the future evaluation is tricky. You generally have to make some kind of assumption. Maybe you try to track something that was in the IPCC ensemble. But I mean, in AI, we always think of future predictions as just a work of art that cannot be validated, but I understand and feel bad for the climate modelers that they're actually being asked for that.
Thank you.
Are you from NCAR? Oh, okay.
We've
Okay.
actually seated the audience with a bunch of media people.
That's okay. So you have one?
Yes. You addressed a lot of my thoughts about like data-driven extremes
Mhm.
predictions
Mhm.
in your last slide. So thank you for that. I am just also curious if you have any mechanism for looping in, you know, anthropogenic changes for those, especially the cascading hazards, just because it seems like, you know, where someone like hazards is not just about the climate system, right? It's about the like whether or not the area was disturbed and whether or not it's close to anything. So
Yeah, I'm part of a research cluster in the School of Engineering called RISE, Resilient Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. And so I'm really interested in how to inject climate justice priorities directly into any technology we develop. So one thing we talked about in a grant proposal that we wrote, but I didn't write any papers on it, is say you have some kind of warning system for an extreme. It should warn both communities directly in the path and vulnerable communities. So there's a legacy in this country that lower income communities would generally have incinerators or sewage treatment plants or factories placed nearer to them than into more affluent communities. And some of that has caused different public health outcomes and vulnerabilities, like, for example, to asthma and lung disease. So if there's a community like that and you're forecasting wildfire spread, that community should be warned, even if they're not in the direct path, due to their increased vulnerability. But there, I mean, I don't know, my sort of inspirational goals there are even more intractable, but I do want to keep being inspired by them because I want the new technology to, you know, take equity concerns into account, but really, you know, the blue sky would be able to somehow undo a legacy of climate injustice. And it's something I'm motivated on, but don't have any papers about to talk about. I think you were talking about maybe even more than that. But
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and that's super interesting direction to take it to. I
Mm.
agree. I think what I'm talking about is like, at least, I've done a lot of work with post-wildfire landslides, so like with the
Mm.
cascading hazard
Oh,
idea, and just one of the challenges is it feels like we need not one model, but 10 models, because we
Mm.
actually have a bunch of different types of events
mm,
going on, because like, you know, one post wildfire landslide might have been like triggered by a little drizzle in some place where there was a bad road cut,
oh,
or right, you know, like that kind of stuff. And so it's very hard for the physically based models to deal with that. And I'm also curious, it seems like the ML models would also potentially have trouble if they didn't have enough data.
yeah, I think that would be the only concern. All this work needs to be done in concert with people that actually do study the infrastructure. So infrastructure resilience, you also need to study infrastructure. But yeah, I don't have anything I've done directly with that yet, but we are actually writing grants on this that sprung out of RISE, the Resilient Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity team at in the College of Engineering here. Any other questions?
Got about 1 minute left.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is sort of a philosophical question.
Yeah.
When do we infuse AI into a particular work stream? So the
Hmm.
example I can give you is we have this macro systems project where we're sort of eventually trying to classify species from space, but there are different scales. So
Tree
you
species.
sort of like tree in
And
forest,
plants,
but
okay,
can't do plant
yeah.
species. But we sort of need to impose this dichotomous tree structure on the models, right? Like, is it large, is it small, and then run an AI? Or do we run? And so your second example where you sort of like started AI one step earlier, instead of labeling all of the non-avalanche data, you sort of moved the start of the AI back. So when we're trying to design these architectures, one of the big questions that comes up frequently is like, how early do we infuse the AI? How much data processing do I do? How ready do I get my data? How much of my priori knowledge do I bake into the data set before I let AI go? Do you think I should do that really early in the process, or do you think I should bake all of my information in first and then still do it?
So if Earth Lab is not yet aware of this field called AutoML, I think it would interest you because it deals with both reproducible pipelines and you know, like, how do you have your data munging be more principled? But it's still an active field. So people are now applying machine learning to these exact questions. So there's a reinforcement learning approach to what data augmentations you should do and what order you should do them in. And these have been studied when you have a particular downstream task in mind, like I'm going to learn a naive Bayes model afterwards, then it's possible to do something like that. So I would say the very questions you're asking are questions that the machine learning community is actively wrestling with and has some approaches to. But on the flip side, when there's absolutely no human in the loop, we start to get terribly biased systems because of the historical bias in any data. So yeah, those are some potential starting points. Like on the positive, if you want to use ML through your whole ML pipeline, check the current literature on AutoML. But on the flip side, we know even some of the measured media data in this country is has location bias that biases against certain communities. So any models that we learn just from the raw data without human intervention might carry that forward.